For at least a century, the United States has been the world's preeminent military power. Since 1945, it has stood at the head of a world system created in its own image and designed with its interests in mind. And of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, that power was uncontested. But the era of American leadership, or American empire, whichever descriptor you prefer, is drawing to a close. One reason for that end is the rise of China. The other is this guy.
We have nothing to do with that. What happens in the Strait, we're not going to have anything to do with, because these countries, China will go up and they'll fuel up their beautiful ships and they'll leave and they'll take care of themselves. There's no reason for us to do it. Look, problem with the Strait, a guy can take a mine, drop it in the water, and say, oh, it's unsafe. It's not like you're taking out an army or you're taking out a country, or they can drop it. Or you can take a machine gun from the shore and shoot a few bullets at a ship, or maybe an over-the-shoulder missile, small missiles. That's not for us. That'll be for France. That'll be for whoever's using the Strait.
That was Donald Trump saying that it's not the USA's job to provide safe passage for ships in the Strait of Hormuz, even though they started the war that closed it, and that other countries should sort it out themselves. And it was a repeat of this advice that he tweeted out earlier on Tuesday. This time he was singling out the United Kingdom. He said there that if the UK wanted oil, they should just, quote, go to the Strait and take it. And he said, you'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore. So why, you may ask, does this specifically signal the end of American empire? That little clip I showed you and that little Truth Social post from the president. Well, this tweet from Cornell historian Nicholas Mulder gives a clue. So he says, hegemony in Kindleberger's sense of leadership plus global public good provision ends once you abandon the preservation of global open sea lanes, the minimum commitment of liberal maritime power since 1815. So to translate, Kindleberger, he's an economic historian, came up with the hegemonic stability theories. This is the idea that when you have one dominant power, the world order is more stable. So the hegemon might use that power to enhance their own interests, of course, they're not going to be benevolent, but so long as they provide stability and public goods, it might be in everyone else's interests to go along with it. And Nicholas Mulder is pointing out that in the British Empire and the period of American hegemony, a key public good, maybe the preeminent one, that the leading power provided was the preservation of open sea lanes, so enabling international trade. So you might lose a bit of sovereignty because you've got this hegemon that has the ultimate power, but they're providing this public good, which is that you're not going to have piracy, that you're going to be able to trade safely throughout the world. And what you've seen there in that clip from Donald Trump and in his Truth Social post is Trump is not only admitting the US can't provide that, but also that they're actively undermining the ability of commercial ships to have safe passage. Aaron, in this segment, we're going to go through a few indications of the decline of American empire or the end of American empire and how Donald Trump is announcing it. But I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, we discussed this a bit with Mark Carney when he was saying we were happy to go along with American hypocrisy when they were still providing public goods that we could benefit from. He was angry about the Greenland issue and Donald Trump using the global trade system to punish people with tariffs. Now the fact that the empire is specifically interrupting international trade and global safe passage through the seas, that is kind of the definition of it's no longer the hegemon that people can rely on.
I think so. I mean, we refer to it as the Pax Americana, which has really existed since 1945, the American peace. Another way of saying, America has been this unipolar hegemon, undoubtedly since the end of the Cold War, but I think really you can say since 1945 we've lived in a Pax Americana. The point of the Pax Americana wasn't that the whole world was at peace. If you lived in quite large parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia or east of the Berlin Wall, you wouldn't say, well, it was a wonderful Pax Americana. But for the rest of us, it was quite nice. But as Carney hinted at with that speech, that's kind of going now. And emblematic of that is the presence of US military bases. These are meant to make your country more safe, not less safe. And the experience of countries like Qatar and Bahrain and the UAE in the last month has been the complete opposite. They've become targets precisely because they're home to US bases. They haven't protected those places. They've made them actually more vulnerable. They've been a source of exposure rather than security. Those are the first 2 points. Thirdly, Trump said that, look, China's getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz. They can do it. Why can't France and the UK? China is getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz because it's Iranian oil, right? They're buying Iranian oil. There's now Iranian oil that's also going to be going to India for about $100 a barrel. So if his quote-unquote solution here is that Britain and France buy Iranian oil, thereby ending sanctions on Iranian oil, if that's the solution, I mean, I don't think anybody really saw that one coming. The incoherence of Trump, though, I think is really secondary to the point you're making, which is that America is no longer a guarantor of international trade. And that quintessential kind of idea of comparative advantage, David Ricardo, one place can produce more of this and another can produce more of that, and it's of net benefit to everyone because the factors of production are more efficient. So Portugal can sell port and Britain can sell wool, and that makes sense for them to focus on that and them to focus on that. The core presumption of comparative advantage is that the costs of trade and transit and logistics are very low. They're close to zero, which is broadly true, by the way, nowadays with containerization and whatnot. What's changing, though, with the potential collapse of American hegemony and the demise of safe shipping lanes, is that those costs are going up. A very, very important moment. And I think it does pull the veil back a bit. It was almost left-coded to say for a very long time that globalization is really a reflection of American empire. They're the same thing, Of course, some neocons would overtly say that, but liberals wouldn't really say that kind of thing. It was left to the radical left and the radical right. I think what Trump is doing is really just exposing that to be undoubtedly true.
Well, exposing it and ending it, right? Because I suppose there's two arguments one can make about sort of American global leadership, which is, you can have this sort of liberal idea, which is there isn't actually an American empire. We're all sovereign nations making contracts with each other, and it's all sort of governed by law, and we've moved beyond empire. Or you can say there's American empire and it has to be destroyed because empire is bad. Or you can say there's American empire. It's not perfect, but it has provided many countries in the world with the security and the predictability that they are able to develop. And I mean, talking to obviously, America's actions in Southeast Asia in much of the 20th century were a complete disgrace. But if you look at the polling in Vietnam, Vietnamese people, very pro-America, very anti-China. So the Pax Americana, as it's been called, its popularity hasn't just been combined. When you talk about this, people say, well, yeah, it was fine for Europe. For the rest of the world, it was a disaster.
Well, Pax Americana is very popular in Vietnam now because they've been, I think, the world's even outperforming China in terms of annual growth. They've been the world's best exporter for about 25 years. So it's been very good for them recently. I mean, I'm sure if you ask Vietnamese, 3 million Vietnamese died, right?
If you ask
Vietnamese
then,
in the 80s or the 70s, you get a very different answer. You're right, though. In that part of the world, the place that has the most antipathy to America still is obviously China and North Korea.
Talking about trade, you mentioned military bases. Let's go on to military bases because in the British Empire, they had military bases everywhere, but it's formal colonialism. Right? You didn't ask the country. American Empire, the idea has generally been that you get consent from the government, whether or not they're democratic, and it's based on this quid pro quo, which is the Americans put their bases in your country, and then you get the protection of the Americans, the preeminent military power. Obviously, throughout the 20th century, core element of this was NATO, specifically for Europe. Trump has now all but ended that, though. So Trump today told The Telegraph that he is strongly considering pulling out of NATO. Asked if he might leave NATO by The Telegraph, he said, quote, "Oh yes, I would say it's beyond reconsideration. I was never swayed by NATO. I always knew they were a paper tiger, and Putin knows that too, by the way." Secretary of State Marco Rubio was slightly more diplomatic on Fox News.
I've been one of the strongest defenders of NATO during my time as a United States Senator because I found great value in it. And it wasn't just about defending Europe. I said it also allowed us to have military bases in Europe that allowed us to project power into different parts of the world when our national security was threatened. If now we have reached a point where the NATO alliance means that we can't use those bases, that in fact, that we can no longer use those bases to defend America's interests, then NATO is a one-way street. Then NATO is simply about us having troops in Europe to defend Europe. But when we need their help, not their help, we're not asking them to conduct airstrikes. When we need them to allow us to use their military bases, their answer is no. Then why are we in NATO? You have to ask that question. Why do we have billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, over the years, trillions of dollars, and all these American forces stationed in the region. If we can only use, in our time of need, we're not going to be allowed to use those bases.
He's very pissed off because not all of America's, lots of countries are not allowing America to use their bases in them. Obviously, we didn't let them use Diego Garcia until they started the war, because then afterwards we reclassified it as defensive. A bit strange. France, Italy, and Spain have now all refused, to one extent or another. I think some of them, allowing it with restrictions. They've all refused to allow the U.S. military to even use their airspace. So that's what has pissed off the Americans. Of course, the difference is that Marco Rubio there is saying that we need them, and everyone's like, well, this was a war of choice, and also we don't really trust the Americans to help us in our time of need anyway, given that Donald Trump is president. Keir Starmer has still, though, said that NATO is essential, although with some qualifications. When asked about Trump saying he might leave the alliance, Keir Starmer said this.
Let me say a number of things in response to that. Firstly, NATO is the single most effective military alliance the world has ever seen. And it has kept us safe for many decades, and we are fully committed to NATO. Secondly, that whatever the pressure on me and others, whatever the noise, I'm going to act in the British national interest in all the decisions that I make. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that this is not our war, and we're not going to get dragged into it. But I'm equally clear that when it comes to defence and security and our economic future, we have to have closer ties with Europe. That's why we had the summit last year. This year, as I've just announced, there'll be a further summit. We will make good on the commitments that we put in place last year, but we will also go further in relation to the alignment.
I thought that was actually quite a good answer from Starmer. So he's saying, we're 100%, this is not our war, we're not going to get involved. We are going to move closer to Europe. I mean, sort of saying there's going to be a summit in the summer is a bit vague. What does that mean? But sort of what
we can have a Zoom call.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Keir.
I mean, the message he's trying to give is that we have decided we want to move closer to Europe. I suppose sticking to NATO, do you agree with Keir Starmer that NATO has been the most effective military alliance the world has ever seen?
Well, first off, we are involved. We've been allowing the US to use our bases. We are involved. He posted a video onto his TikTok account about planes and helicopters and Chinooks and aircraft carriers, and I think there was some Top Gun style music, and he's now realised that's gone down like a shit sandwich, and he's done what they call the reverse double ferret. So they yoinked the video, and it's like it never happened kind of thing, which is probably wise, because it's a deeply unpopular war. Donald Trump is deeply unpopular. He's only got favourable ratings from 18% of the British public. It's his war. It's an unnecessary war. In terms of NATO and its success, I think this is a classic case of robo-Starmer. He's saying the establishment orthodoxy. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think he's saying it because he's just heard it so many times. I don't think he's actually examined that. Britain has had an unprecedented period of safety, since 1945 in terms of, the island of Britain from foreign enemies. You can talk about Bloody Sunday in Ireland, you can talk about being embroiled in Iraq and whatnot, but clearly these are different kinds of conflict to the First and Second World Wars, Crimea, etc., etc., etc. We've not been involved in conventional wars in Europe. We've not been involved in a war of national self-defense since World War II. He's saying that's because of NATO. Why do we have nukes? If it's all because of NATO, why do we have nukes? If this alliance is the reason why we've not had a conventional war in Europe, why do we have nukes? I'm of the mind it's actually because of the nuclear weapons. Right? I think that's a much more sensible explanation as to why you don't get hot conventional war between Western Europe and the Americans and, of course, the Soviet Union before the end of the Cold War. That's the fundamental reason. Now, you could say that's wrapped up with NATO, but I think that's the fundamental reason. It's probably my most sort of right-wing opinion, is actually mutually assured destruction to some extent is true. Clearly, though, if you're just looking back at history, it's correct, isn't it, that for Western Europe, it's been a pretty safe, peaceful time in history, and that correlates with NATO. The question is that a sensible basis upon which to act going forward? I think it isn't. I think, in the words of one French politician, we shouldn't be outsourcing the security of Europe to a swing voter in Wisconsin every 4 years. I think that's madness. And it's also very important to say that Trump isn't the end of this. This is the future of the Republican Party that's at stake. So yes, Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, they're not as crazy or as unpredictable as Donald Trump, but they're having to appeal to the same political constituencies internally. So the idea that they're going to return to some sort of predictable orthodoxy that in any way resembles this very successful alliance that we've had, I think is unlikely. Secondly, it is really sad that NATO demurred from its historical mission, which was the North Atlantic. It was about protecting safety and security in the North Atlantic. Very much an instrument of Cold War defense policy. It was about European defense, Western European defense against the Warsaw Pact, even though actually the Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO, not the other way around. Obviously, that's now gone. So you have, after the end of the Cold War, an organization in search of a purpose. What do? Afghanistan. Okay, America was attacked, the only country so far that's triggered Article 5, but it's not in the North Atlantic. What do? They do Libya. I mean, we don't have a map right now, but Libya's quite a long way away from the North Atlantic. I don't think anybody would sensibly say it was a matter of European defence. So you had mission creep with NATO because it was an organisation in search of a purpose. And I think the reality is, Michael, that once the Cold War was over, you probably needed to move beyond it. That doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have forms of collective security. I think it probably does need that. I think that's what Keir Starmer is kind of edging towards. But I don't really understand why that's got to be imbricated with the United States. You know, the European Union and Britain is, you know, a landmass of the best part of 500 million people, $13 trillion economy, a ton of G7 economies. They should be able to look after themselves. I mean, that's the one thing that Trump says, which I think he's right about.
I suppose, so to clarify the nuclear point, so there's an argument, it's been a very sort of peaceful time in Europe historically. Since the formation of NATO. You're saying it's more because there are nuclear weapons around, which just mean that big powers don't go to war with each other anymore because of mutually assured destruction. I suppose the argument that NATO would have been relevant would have been less for Britain and more for those European countries that don't have a nuke.
That's very fair. That's very fair. You know, and also in the world we are today, this question about NATO, it's much more heated, and I think understandably so, for a country like Poland than Britain. You know, yeah. Ireland isn't in NATO, partly because it doesn't really need to be. It's a long way away from Russia. So that's a very fair point. But, you know, there are lots of these multilateral bodies all over the world, and those places have still had war. I think that basis of mutually assured destruction is a big one. Look at India, Pakistan. They've not had a hot war for a long time for a reason. I think there's a really credible argument about if Iran had a nuke. I'm not suggesting it should or it shouldn't, but if Iran had a nuke, one school of thinking, and I don't think they would use it against Israel, I think it would constrain the actions of Tel Aviv quite significantly. I think that's probably true. You certainly wouldn't see this conventional war we're now seeing. That wouldn't be happening if Iran had a nuke because of mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and I mean, military alliances didn't stop the First World War, did they? So
no.
It does seem like what was different was the nuclear weapon. If American empire is over, what will take its place? Well, in the FT this week, friend of the show, Adam Tooze, has written a blueprint for Chinese global leadership. So in the piece, he says this: "It is a truism of the moment that China is the last adult in the room. If Beijing chose to play the part, global leadership would be there for the taking. If you were drafting a 5-point plan for Chinese hegemony at a think tank in Beijing, it might look like this." This is what I love about Adam Tooze. He's sort of confident enough to write a 5-point plan for Chinese hegemony in the Financial Times. Anyway, these are his 5 points. So he says, start by offering to backstop multilateral efforts to provide short-term balance of payment support to countries facing financing issues. And with its huge trade surplus, Beijing has dollars aplenty. That's basically replacing the role of the IMF, isn't it, which is an American-led institution. He says China could then make a gesture of sharing its privileged status in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's not by accident that tankers are rumoured to have been rebadging themselves as Chinese. Now, you can imagine how popular this would be with many countries in the world. Donald Trump is saying, you go and reopen the Strait of Hormuz yourself, right? He's saying, I've prompted this situation where there are sort of drones blowing up these tankers, but you need to go now and you need to kill the drone operators. Adam Tooze is saying, what if the Chinese said, well, we actually can get our ships through and we will help share some of that oil with you? That would, I mean, the Europeans would love that. He then says, Beijing could also offer to contribute some fraction of its huge petroleum reserve to a global oil stability pool. It might offer to do this in cooperation with big suppliers like the Saudis, Malaysians, and Brazilians, sort of similar to the last point, sort of helping with the oil crunch. Then he says, at the same time, Beijing should band together with a coalition of the willing to launch a comprehensive global green investment push, boosting demand for its green industries. Europe would find this hard to resist, but everyone, even the Saudis and Emiratis, are interested in China's clean electro-tech. The sharp distinction between petrostates and electrostates exists mainly in the minds of fossil fuel ideologues, not for those interested in cheap, clean power. So it says, you could maybe sort of relate that to the Marshall Plan. So it's this idea that you could have this Chinese investment, which is based on exporting their technology, which is much like the Marshall Plan. And then finally, and most ambitiously, China could declare that in the interests of global stability, there must be immediate ceasefire negotiations in both Ukraine and the Gulf. Until those talks begin, it is no longer in China's interest to export critical supplies to combatants in either region. This would exert pressure both on Moscow and Washington. Without Chinese rare earths, the US and Israel cannot continue their missile war for long. Aaron, so he's basically saying, the Chinese would provide these public goods of financial stability, of stability when it comes to energy supplies, and then also sort of become some sort of global policeman, even though a less militaristic version than the United States. Are you ready for Adam Tooze's vision of Chinese leadership?
Well, it's not often you read sort of geopolitical fanfic in the Financial Times, which is kind of what this is. Doesn't mean the ideas are bad necessarily. The idea of a shared petroleum reserve, I don't know why they would do that necessarily. I mean, this huge reserve for China allows it to do something really important, Michael, in the present circumstances, which is it allows Beijing and the government to guarantee low prices for their manufacturers. If you're a manufacturer in Germany or in Vietnam or France and your energy prices go up, of course, your sales price goes up as well, right? You have inflation on your side, on the supply side. So, of course, you pass that on to the final consumer. This then confers another advantage on Chinese exporters, right? They can keep their prices the same because the government is guaranteeing a steady supply of petroleum because of this huge 3-month reserve they have. So I don't think they would do that necessarily. On the point about should band together with a coalition of the willing to launch a comprehensive global green investment push. Why does it need to do this? It's already doing it, Michael. Amazing report out today. 49% now of all electricity globally is from renewables. I think that's 4 or 5%. So it's almost over half. By next year, we're going to be over 50% of all electricity worldwide will be from renewables. Solar capacity last year grew worldwide by 511 gigawatts. So solar grew by 511 gigawatts. I say 49% of electricity is from renewables. Most of that 49% is from solar, the overwhelming majority. So solar grew by 511 gigawatts. Fossil fuel capacity grew by 116 gigawatts. Of course, if you're Richard Tice or Nigel Farage, you don't believe this. It's nonsense. It's woke nonsense. But solar outperformed fossil fuel as a source for electrical generation by a factor of 4 last year, right? So this is already happening. 9 in every 10 solar cells in the world are Chinese. Anywhere in the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Britain, Bolivia, Australia, they're Chinese solar cells. The lithium-ion batteries, 75% of those are Chinese. The cobalt, the diode on the lithium-ion battery, I think 75% of that is processed in China. The tantalum that you get in the capacitors, almost all of it's processed in China. So across the entire supply chain for these really critical technologies, batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, and others too, 5G, but we're talking really about the clean tech stuff. Across the entire commodity chain, China has it sorted. And the numbers are exploding. There was that amazing data point from a few days ago that the combined value of Chinese battery firms had increased by about $70 billion in just a couple of weeks. So I don't really understand why, given those numbers I just said, solar capacity grew by 511 gigawatts, fossil fuel capacity by 116. Why do you need a coalition of the willing, comprehensive global? It just sounds like, white shirt, tie, pencil necks, G7 meetings. The Chinese aren't doing that. They are industrialists producing clean energy at huge scale, very cheaply, just getting on with it. So why do they need to do that would be my question, Michael.
Okay, it seems to me like you're making more the argument which is on the front of The Economist magazine this week. We can bring this up. Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. It's great front page. You can see Donald Trump there and she looking happy in the background. I do tend to agree that you need to flesh out more why this is in China's interest. I suppose the best attempt I can make at saying why a move like this would make sense for the Chinese is the possibility, and maybe it's a slim possibility, that American governance gets more competent in the future. Because I think there is an argument that Joe Biden was actually putting real pressure on China. So he was genuinely sort of restricting certain key goods, so the highest level chips. Obviously, then China sort of was driven to innovate its own, but clearly that was putting some pressure on them, some strain on them. It was also forming, alliances with other countries that were putting China under threat. There was a serious chance that the Americans were going to be able to encircle China to some degree, not overthrow the CCP, but at least slow down its advance. Now, obviously, under Trump, that's all gone. There is no way that sort of an America as chaotic as it is under Trump can slow down China's advance. But maybe China would sort of take this short-term cost so that it could build the kind of international networks and infrastructure that would mean that a more competent future American White House could not recreate what Joe Biden did. That would be my best argument for why, even though in their short-term interest, there's no need for them to do any of this. It might make us, if this is America at its weakest, which is big if, then now would be the time to build those China-led institutions.
Trump said something, again, accurate, which is that actually rare earth metals aren't that rare. It's about the processing. So I think China is home to about 70% of known deposits of rare earth metals, but you can find them elsewhere. But it basically has a monopoly on the processing part. And the processing is really important. Cobalt is another example. Cobalt, for a very long time, was a waste product. It's only really with renewable technologies that has this value. And the processing, which is very expensive, very energy demanding, etc. They have that monopoly on it. So for the Americans, you have this really important material, rare earth minerals, which, by the way, F-35s need them. And they have said publicly, I think it was on Business Insider, they only have a supply of about 2 to 3 months of rare earth minerals. This could be circumvented by just having a domestic processing capability. They don't have it, right? So something as simple as that, I think that really gets to the heart of the dysfunction of American politics. That's the first thing. If there was a problem in China, they would just sort it out, okay? And that's not happening in America. And in terms of America's ability to compete with China on cost with these technologies, it just doesn't exist. Michael, BYD now stands for Build Your Dreams, the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer by sales. And actually, is it more valuable than Tesla? Probably not. But it's by sales. It's a big company. It's up there now with some of the biggest car companies. Although of course it's still behind the biggest ones like Toyota and whatnot. How many people are in their research and development team?
BYD's research and development team.
Yeah, which don't make just cars. To be clear, they're also a huge battery producer.
10,000.
100,000 people.
Wow.
You can't compete with that scale, right? 100,000 people. Every year, China has, for now, the demographics aren't very good. That's going to deteriorate over time. But for now, China has about 1.2 million engineers every year. Of course, they have people retiring as well. But every year, they have 1.2 million engineers entering the labor market. 1.2 million. Do you know how many America has?
100,000.
120,000. So, and that's not bad, right? America's population is significantly smaller than China. But China is much bigger by population, but also per capita, it's producing more engineers. So you have so many more engineers, you have such a bigger market, America just can't compete. The scale it's too much. I think the talent pool, the scale of the market, and the clearly excellent leadership that the CCP has had with regards to these technologies, it's just a fact they've just left America in the dust. Now, can America be on the ascendant again in 30, 40 years' time? Of course it can. There's nothing unique or special about China and its government and so on. They would have to make a series of good decisions. That's presently not happening. Let me give you one more example. At the start of this conflict with the Iran war, we heard this claim that this was all 5D chess, right? They're taking out Iranian oil from the Chinese supply, even though Iranian oil is only about 12% of Chinese supply, which is a lot, but it's not 50%. They're taking out Venezuela, they're taking out China, and it's a new great game to deprive China of really important fossil fuels. Okay. At the same time, China, basically 25 years ago, secured 50% of the supply of cobalt in Congo. The Americans are nowhere on that stuff. So it's like the Americans are playing Connect 4. They think they're playing chess, and the Chinese are playing chess. I think that's an outgrowth of a set of ideological presumptions, really, which was leave it to the market. The state can't help private enterprise meet certain objectives and needs and challenges. And we're always going to be number one. And I think, look, yeah, of course, America can turn that around, but it's going to take a very long time. So the idea that it's going to happen in 1 or 2 administrations, I don't buy. And I think, finally, the American system is so built towards adversarialism, I don't think they can build a consensus, actually, to meet these challenges.
Yeah, well, it's strange because they used to have, whether or not you like them, they did used to have bipartisan consensuses on like international policy. But there is something about populism and polarization, which means that like the American system just cannot function and cannot have policy that lasts more than like 2 years, really, because even if you get a new president, then you have your midterms. So there is something about the combination of modern technology, I think, and maybe sort of demographic structure and America's form of adversarial democracy that just means that it cannot have long-term policy, which does mean buy shares in China, not the United States.